few announcements about the Writers and Scholars series, of which this is the inaugural one semester. My name is Jim Diedrich. I'm happy to say I'm now Professor of English. Simple title. Simple title. And as long as we're introducing people, I also wanted to recognize and congratulate Dr. Jamie Stammen, who just defended successfully his dissertation. But I also want to make sure that everyone has a copy, or will pick up a copy of this nice little brochure here that tells us who will be speaking the rest of the semester, who will be visiting. I wanted to mention Sheri Joseph, who is the author of several novels, most recently a novel that I absolutely could not put down. And if you would like to know more about it, I'm glad to talk to any of you about it. I think it's just a stunning novel, where you can find me. She will be speaking on October 16th, on Wednesday, October 16th, right here. And if you want to hear an incredible reading from an incredible novel, I highly recommend this. And as I said, I'll be glad to talk to you more about this. And our newest colleague, Professor Esther Lee, can also tell you more about our speaker who is coming on November 7th. This is, I think, Cindy Corey, wonderful poet who teaches in Florida. And Esther knows her poetry more than I do, so you can ask Professor Lee if you'd like more information about her. And on the back of the brochure is a list of our Spring Writers Festival visiting artists. So please have a look at that. And we're all looking forward to that event, which, as some of you know, is one of the great highlights of Scott College in spring. So take note. So I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I'm delighted to be introducing Professor Leeanne Richardson. Like you, I'm eager to hear you talk about Michael Field. And since she is the reason you've come here tonight, I will try to make my comments as brief as possible. But since she's going to be talking about poetry tonight, I wanted to just spend maybe a couple of minutes saying a few words about her book, New Woman in Colonial Adventure Fiction in Victorian Britain, Gender, Genre, and Empire. And I'm not bringing it up because it's for sale out there, because if I were an undergraduate, I would think the price is a little steep, but you can check it out from the library. So, but I wanted to mention it because I think it holds special interests for students and faculty at a women's college. If you think for a moment about fiction published in England at or near the end of the 19th century, certain canonical titles come to mind. Tess the D'Urbervilles, Portrait of Dorian Gray, Heart of Darkness. And we can expand that list of well-known titles by adding what I, or we might call, pop canonical novels. Novels that once were marginalized as low culture, but have actually gained in critical status in the past several decades. And that would include Dracula, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then a couple of novels you may not have heard of, She and King Solomon's Mines. These were extremely popular novels at the end of the century, not held in quite as high critical regard as Heart of Darkness, Tess the D'Urbervilles, and Portrait of Dorian Gray, but nonetheless, extremely popular. And of course, all of these books share one thing in common. They were all written by men. And I think many of us would be hard-pressed to think about novels, canonical, famous novels written in the last 20 years of the 19th century. What Professor Richardson's book has done is to demonstrate that a series of important New Woman novels published during the same period, and I'll just name a few: Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, Mona Caird's The Daughters of Danis, Ella Dixon's Story of a Modern Woman, Flora Annie Steele's On the Face of the Waters, were not only also a vital part of the literary landscape and literary discourse of the late 19th century, but they were in implicit dialogue with many of these better-known novels by male novelists that most of us have bouncing around in our heads. At the same time, these novels by women, these New Woman novels, were engaged in important cultural debates ranging from Irish Home Rule to women's suffrage to the expanding empire and growing human rights movement. So, for the students in the audience especially, and especially those of you possibly exploring research topics for this year or next, have a look at Professor Richardson's book and the women writers whose novels deserve to be as well known as those out there in their counterparts. Professor Richardson received her master's degree from the University of Chicago, her PhD from Indiana University, and she is currently an associate professor of English at Georgia State University, where she has been teaching for, I was going to say for 10 years, but no, since 2000, so almost And her presentation is there for you to see on the screen. Professor.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Dr. Cousins for inviting me here, and to you all for coming to hear me talk about Michael Field, who I'm proselytizing for. I love Michael Field's poetry, and their life and their history is just fascinating. And so I'll talk about one tiny slice, but perhaps give you a taste of more. I'm not sure how available the handout of poems I made was. Not. Okay. I put together a handout of poems which can be made available because the range of their poetry is very wide. In the 1880s and 1890s, they wrote some books of poetry that have gotten the most critical attention. One is Sight and Sound, which is a series of poems that are inspired by famous paintings. They traveled through Italy with an art historian to learn about all of these famous paintings, and then wrote poems that translated by Titian into verse, and they're amazing. They also have a book called Long Ago, which presents sapphic fragments of Sappho's verse that then they spin out into full poems. Great stuff, great stuff. I never went and studied Michael Field when I was an undergraduate. I never studied Michael Field when I was in graduate school, even in a fairly cutting-edge program that featured Victorian studies instead of just Victorian literature. Indeed, I still have the text from my graduate school course, and it's called The Major Victorian Poets, Tennyson, Browning, Arnold. And just to clarify, the Browning in that title is not Elizabeth Barrett, Robert Browning. Fortunately, the field of British Victorian poetry has changed in the past 20 years, a change that has allowed for more diverse voices, more equitable gender representation, more visibility for those excluded from romantic accounts of literary history. That legacy of romanticism posits a male poetic genius who can transcend his gender to reach emotional heights of expression and mix that with his manly intellect to produce great poetry. Women in this schema are naturally emotional, and therefore their poems are merely confessional. Fortunately, this vision of the female poet no longer holds sway. Right? And to be fair, my undergraduate and graduate professors didn't subscribe to it, but the women poets' absence from my syllabi was a legacy of this way of thinking about women writers. They were just excluded from the canon, sort of out of habit. But the last 20 years have been very good for women poets. My particular interest is in women's poetry of the turn of the 20th century, in part because there were so many competing voices in the years from 1880 to about 1920. Tennyson, Browning, and Arnold died in 1892, 1889, and 1888, respectively, and a plethora of voices and schools of poetry emerged. So this is when W.E. Henley and Rudyard Kipling are writing manly poems of the military and of the empire. This is when new women writers address themes of women's liberation from the domestic sphere. And this is when aesthetes and decadents embraced art for art's sake. So the late 19th century England was full of aesthetic and intellectual activity and debate of all kinds. But I want to draw out the context of the aesthetes and the decadents because Michael Field are most often associated with those movements. But first, an explanation of that phrase, Michael Field are. I'm an English professor. I'm usually a stickler about subject-verb agreements. But Michael Field troubles into conceptual categories and ways of understanding the singular and the plural. I can't see the screen, I did change it. Michael Field is the pseudonym of Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper, an aunt and niece who collaboratively wrote more than 25 closet dramas and 11 volumes of poetry. They insisted that reviewers, even those who knew their individual identities, refer to Michael Field as he and his, and to keep their poetic persona individual and masculine. In a letter they wrote to Robert Browning, you can't escape him, they not to reveal their identity. The report of lady authorship will dwarf and enfeeble our work at every turn, they write. And they imply two reasons for this. The first is self-censorship. We cannot be stifled in drawing room conventionalities. And the second is impact on their reception. You are robbing us of real criticism, such as man gives man. Thus, Michael Field not only shakes up my sense of pronouns, they also undermine the traditional model of the male singular poetic genius. And I'll go back to aesthetes, and especially the decadents. These proponents of art for art's sake are associated with writers like Oscar Wilde, whose preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray boldly declares that all art is quite useless because it should be beautiful and not pressed into a moralizing or didactic function. Field insisted they were not decadent. A common categorization of their early work because of the negative connotations that could attach to the term, especially in terms of sexual excess or perversity, as the final quotation by Richard Gilman suggests. Both movements came to England by way of France. Gautier and Baudelaire used the term decadence proudly to reject what they saw as the banality of quote-unquote progress. The things on the progress side of that column are things we usually appreciate. Technology, science, advancement. But the problem the decadents saw with all of this advancement is that it was made everything uniform, everything the same, everything boring, everything as you would expect, which left no room, they thought, for artistic innovation. So, because of this legacy from the French, many of the terms used to talk about this poetry are French. Fin de siècle is merely French for end of the century, so fin de siècle gets used to describe poetry, especially that's influenced by the French. And the femme fatale, the fatal woman, the woman who is dangerous to men because of her disturbing sexual allure, like think Glenn Close and Fatal Attraction, classic femme fatale. But before Glenn Close, perhaps the most famous femme fatale, and definitely the most femme fatale of the fin de siècle, was Salome. The story of Salome appears in a few brief verses in the New Testament, in Matthew and in Mark, and it's quite simple. Salome dances for her stepfather Herod's birthday and asks for the head of John the Baptist as a reward. Apparently it's done at her mother's instigation, and Salome gives the head to her mother. Period. Right? Many painters, including Renaissance painters, have represented Salome, but in the fin de siècle, there was an almost literal explosion of Salomes. And these are great images, but I'm just going to give you a sense, there's lots of heads on platters, of the many varieties of Salomes that are represented. Gustave Moreau, a French painter, painted several oils of Salome as well as numerous pastels and sketches. And one of these, called The Apparition, is enshrined in a novel called Au revoir by the French writer J.K. Huysmans. I put Huysmans' name because it's hard to spell on the slide, but I literally didn't open the latest version. You could ask me about Huysmans. The title is generally translated as Against Nature or Against the Grain, and the book was reputed to be the Yellow Book, a corrupted, poor, innocent Dorian Gray. And it was considered a sort of handbook for English decadents. Huysmans' main character loves this Moreau painting and spends hours at a time contemplating it. And his musings are an ideal example of what is meant by the term femme fatale, but as well as what the figure of Salome came to represent to the decadents. Huysmans quotes the passage from Matthew in which Salome appears, and then he writes, in Gustave Moreau's work, conceived independently of Testament themes, Des Esseintes, his main character, at last saw realized the superhuman and exotic Salome of his dreams. She was no longer the mere performer who arrests the cry of desire and passion from an old man by a perverted twisting of her loins. She became, in a sense, the symbolic deity of indestructible lust. Like the Helen of antiquity, fatal to all who approach her, all who behold her, all whom she touches. She no longer sprang from biblical traditions, could no longer even be assimilated with the living image of the whore of Babylon, the royal prostitute of the apocalypse, garbed like her in jewels and purples, and painted like her, for she was not hurled by affected power, by a supreme force, into the alluring vileness of debauchery. And he goes on in this vein for 8 pages. And it was hard not to read the whole thing. It's something else. But I quote this to demonstrate how important Salome as a figure is for the decadence in France, and next, a demonstration of her importance to the decadence in England. Wilde's play, Salome, also stresses Salome's danger to men. The line, "You should not look at her so much," appears repeatedly in this play, uttered to and by various male characters. These illustrations are by Aubrey Beardsley, and Beardsley's illustrations highlight the perversity of her request, her dance, and the woman herself. The slide called "The Climax" features Salome kissing that severed head of John the Baptist. The rest of this talk will focus on the Michael Field poem entitled "A Dance of Death," which enacts a retelling of the Salome story based on legendary accounts of Salome's death by decapitation. As the legend goes, while ice skating, Salome falls through the ice and severs her head on a sharp sheet of jagged ice. This is interesting. After having John the Baptist decapitated, Salome herself suffers the same fate. But what makes this more interesting is that the poem does not appear alongside Field's lush and decadent 1890s poems. It's not from the fin de siècle when all of these Salome depictions are rampant. This appears in Field's 1912 volume called Poems of Adoration. 1912. Wait a minute, that means if you know Field's biography, these poems were composed and published after Michael Field had completed their conversion to Catholicism, in which they rejected the pagan and decadent elements of their previous work. Bradley and Cooper were well aware of Salome's identification with decadent transgression and perversity, and the fact that they take her up after their religious conversion suggests that they wanted to reappropriate her and have her serve other ends. Thus, Field takes this classic decadent figure and utterly transfigures her in their volume of devotional verse. In Field's rendering, Salome becomes a figure like John the Baptist, a martyr, a prophet, a symbol of devotion to a vision. Paradoxically, then, the infamous Salome enters the pantheon of martyrs, celebrated for her dance, the very thing that also damns her. Many critics have trouble reconciling religious devotion with artistic creation. Marion Thane opens her chapter on Field's Catholic poetry by noting, "For current critics of Michael Field's poetry, interest in the oeuvre ends when the two women convert to Catholicism. It is their joyous pagan poetry and their abandoned sensuality that has generated the recent flurry of critical excitement. The poetry composed after the conversion is seen as embarrassingly florid, conventional, and emotional." Frederick Roden similarly notes that, quote, "Feminist critics have viewed their conversion as an end rather than a new beginning, part of the story of clerical male oppression." And there are a few critics who take seriously the poetry they write after their conversion. And these critics often work to demonstrate how Michael Field reconciles religion with their lesbian sexuality and or their early embrace of pagan symbols and images. Field moves these critics, say, from Sappho to Christ, or alternately from Sapphic to Marian imagery. And the other major line of criticism presents a mystic transubstantiated Holy Trinity consisting of Bradley Cooper and Wim Chow, the dog whose death figured as a Christ-like sacrifice that inspired his owner's conversion. It's hard to say that with a straight face. But these two women were devoted to this dog, and they have a volume called Wim Chow, Flame of Love. And I saw it in the British Library, and it is bound in this beautiful russet suede. It is a complete devotion, literally and figuratively, to their child dog. It's hard to get back focus. In short, the critics who address Field's devotional poetry look for the theology implicit in their poems. Generally, the consensus is that religious discourse offered a queer space for the expression of sexual deviance, and that Field's post-conversion poetry used Catholic symbol, sacrament, and story as vehicles for articulating their longing for one another. My analysis of A Dance of Death performs a different task, looking for the poetic manifesto implicit in their biblical representation. Frederick Roden claimed that Bradley and Cooper had a harder time reconciling Catholicism with their art than with their homosexuality. I think he's right. And I assert that A Dance of Death isn't really about religious and sexual identity. It's an artistic manifesto. They make Salome a representative of the artist who will sacrifice herself in service to her art, a martyr. And they defend her defiance of rules, norms, and doctrines in her pursuit of artistic expression. But they do this paradoxically. To some degree, they defy biblical authority, but they find their inspiration in a biblical tale. Right? As artists, they challenge the Bible and are inspired by it. Their art both takes it up and turns it around. Right? And now to the poem itself. I mean, as I analyze the poem, just because this is a lot of stuff all at once, keep several things in mind. Salome as artist figure, rather than femme fatale, paradoxical representations, and how these two things relate to martyrdom and authority. The first stanza, instead of describing Salome, introduces the setting and significantly the speaker of the poem. The narrator of the poem, while in absence, present in the greater part, sort of standing above merely describing, is embodied, in plural form no less, in the opening stanza. How strange this ice, so motionless and still, yet calling as with music to our feet, right, our feet, the embodied narrator. So that they chafe and dare their swiftest motion to repeat these harmonies of challenge, sounds that fill the floor of ice, as the crystalline sphere around the heavens is filled with such a song that when they hear the stars, each in their heaven, are drawn along. And there are several things just in this opening stanza significant to the poem as a whole. First is the form. It is fairly regularly iambic, although the line length varies from 3 to 5 stresses. The rhyme scheme, too, has the same quality of being nearly regular. There's a significant amount of rhyme, and these rhymes seem to fall into pattern, but the rhymes aren't regular or regularly repeated. For instance, the first stanza in its entirety, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, E, F, G, E, G, F, H, I, H, I. So there is definitely a pattern, but it can't be predicted in advance, merely recorded after the fact. So the first important element introduced in the opening stanza is irregular regularity, my first paradox. Second, and more importantly, I think, there is the naturalization of desire. The sounds that draw the listener to dance along the floor of ice are compared with the celestial song that draws the stars in their courses. And indeed, this suggests that the desire that draws the speaker to the ice is not only natural, but also perhaps divine. The poem represents desire as natural, if not sacred. And last, I want to draw attention to the as in the second line of the slide. The poem repeatedly uses a somewhat unusual grammatical structure, the as and use depending simile, a comparison, right, as well as the conditional as if. This would not be worth mentioning, except that this construction recurs, creating an insistent comparative in which nothing is, but is as. My contention is that understanding the as construction is a key to unlocking this poem. Indeed, the speaker in this stanza is called to dance just as Salome does in the rest of the poem. This neutralizes the sexuality of Salome. She's not a unique femme fatale who dances to destroy men's will. Rather, her feet, or her artistic motivation to dance, are just as our feet. This last phrase, our feet, is also, of course, a pun on foot as the basic unit of poetic rhythm. Michael Field's feet literally constitute their poems. The comparative represented in that as construction encapsulates the logic of the poem, the logic of both and, right? What Marion Bain refers to as Field's, quote, highly developed poetics of paradox and double narrative. The Salome of their poem is both biblical, from Matthew and Mark, and Gnostic in this bizarre form of ice dancing. Both Christian and pagan, both empowered and punished, icy cold and passionate, beautiful and appalling, still and active, dead and alive. Similarly, the embodied narrator who literally longs for physical artistic expression, but then leaves the reader written verbal art, is both earthly and divine, both physical and mystical, both real and literary. And significantly, both two women and one man, both female and prophetic, both submissive to religious authority and fully authoritative. And while one might consider this kind of irregular regularity a classic instance of Wildean paradox, the logic of both and suggests a different way to understand the poem's formal qualities as well. Oh, see a dancer, opens the second stanza, and this stanza records in joyous description Salome's movements over the ice. The third stanza reiterates, she dances, she dances, she dances, as she never had lost in lands where there is snow, the orange, immeasurable glow. Here the as recurs, again in a key moment. Salome moves as if she were still in the Orient, and context, it seems, is everything, for this moment marks a turn in the poem, from the sheer joy of dance and beauty of body and world to the suggestion of death. The next stanza ends with a question. Does she not know deeps under ice can drown? An ice-covered river is a classic example of surface and depth, of water, of liquid and solid, right, of both and. That solid surface that covers but doesn't eliminate the watery substance underneath. And I stress that Salome's power here is not sexual as it is in biblical and secular accounts, where the promise of her sexual favor seduces Herod into making his fateful promise. In focusing on her expressive dance, Field shifts Salome from femme fatale to artist figure. She dances and her power is aesthetic. She is beauty, not sexuality. Nevertheless, Salome does enact a sort of seduction, but it is a seduction by art. Athwart the ice her dream, her spell she flings, and winter, personified with a capital W, in a rapture of delight, flings up and down the spangles of her light. Nature herself seems to sanction Salome's artistic desire, making it free from censure or sense of sin. Right? Salome is described, right, as a vision by the snow adored, and there's no stigma attached to that. Compare Herod's lament in having looked at Salome in Wilde's rendering. Quote, I have looked at you all evening. Your beauty troubled me. Your beauty has grievously troubled me, and I have looked at you too much. This is the analog to you should not look at her. But even though Salome has the power to enthrall nature, she is still subject to one more powerful than she. In Field's words, will more firm than the ice and frost deems that the ice must be sunny Salome must suffer. The vision is no more seen from the noontide shore. Oh, fearful crash of thunder from the stream, as there were thunder clouds upon its wave. Could nothing save the dancer in the noontide beam? She was engulfed, and all the dances died. This is where a reader familiar with biblical narrative would expect the final as to appear, right, in order to compare Salome's demise with John the Baptist's martyrdom. There's a natural comparison just waiting to be made. Right? And you would expect the pagan Salome to be negatively compared with the pious martyr of John the Baptist. Instead, Field uses direct address, a statement directed to the long-dead John, to establish the connection. O murdered Baptist of the severed head, her head was caught and girded tight, and severed by the ice-monk sword. We don't get an as, we don't get a comparison. And so I think we get not just likeness, but sameness. Her death, thus, is the same as John the Baptist's death, a little more firm decrees it than ours. Indeed, Salome's faith in death looks just like it looked when she gazed upon John's dead face, eyes fixed as they beheld the silver plate that they at Acherontis once beheld. Indeed, we get the expected as in a comparison of Salome with her former self, not in a comparison of Salome and John. And there are two possible readings here. One, that they're not similar, but rather the same, and the other, they are not compared directly because they're completely unlike. It is this ambiguity, this possible both and, that is key. To be sure, the final stanza does express a difference, but it is a difference without moral judgment. Salome's head is dancing on the bright and silver ice. O holy John, how still was laid thy head upon the Sabbath light when thou hadst done God's will. The distinction here, though, in this comparison, is not between holy and unholy, or between the spiritual and the sensual. The difference is between dancing and stillness, between active and passive. Note that John is describing a passive voice. His head was laid. Salome, by contrast, is dancing. The other difference is that John dies having done God's will, whereas Salome dies fulfilling her artistic impulse to dance. But because there is no moral distinction drawn between these two deaths, both deaths are equally sanctioned. And this near conflation of religious martyrdom with dying for an artistic cause brings me to my final set of observations about the poem. Although textual evidence demonstrates that Bradley and Cooper jointly wrote all of their previous publications, Poems of Adoration was written nearly entirely by Cooper, while Mystic Trees, published the following year in 1913, was almost all the work of Bradley. The first time in their careers where they had not collaborated on every word of every poem, or at least had input on every word of every poem. In 1911, Cooper was diagnosed with cancer, and their first biographer, Mary Sturgeon, writes that Cooper's Poems of Adoration are, quote, those of a dying woman, and one who had refused herself any alleviating drug. As their most recent biographer, Emma Donoghue, notes, Cooper refused morphine in order to be lucid enough to keep writing. Makes sense. But also, quote, to suffer some part of what Jesus did. There is a way to read the sacrifice and suffering as upholding Field's Catholic devotions and affirming their subordination to the Church's authority. But the sacrifice was also for art, for prophetic utterance, for a means to express her vision. In other words, their artistic practice in life and their work expresses the both and paradox. But I'm inspired to wonder if Salome's martyrdom and Edith Cooper's, it's difficult to keep the sufferers straight given that both suffer for art, has the same valence as John the Baptist. The Baptist's martyrdom bespeaks his devotion to God and to the coming Christ. Field's sacrifice is for art as much as for religion. To be sure, Cooper wanted to share Christ's passion in she wrote her diaries, Nonetheless, the end result was a volume of poems, indeed a volume of poems that contains a dance of death. And it's an odd poem, clearly. It's an odd poem, but it's even odder in the context of poems of adoration. But poems, as the title suggests, primarily religious and devotional. As Marion Bain notes, lyric poetry, more than prose, is altered by the context in which it's placed. And Michael Field in the 1890s didn't want their poems to appear in the journal Moral because it was associated with decadence, and they didn't want their poems colored by that light. So and so what's interesting here is that A Dance of Death is sandwiched in poems of adoration between looking upon Jesus as he walked and obedience. The context makes it even more interesting. Obedience happens to be about John the Baptist. Don't worry, that's another essay. So that A Dance of Death does not have an anti-Christian tone or message, but it also doesn't have a particularly Christian one. It is indeed both and to explain the contextual rendering of this poem, I return to Salome's head in comparison with John. Particularly this description of Salome's decapitated head rolling along the icebound river. The motion of the head is subjugate to its own law, yet in the face what fear, to what excess compelled. Her head's own law is clearly not God's law, or even that of the will more firm that breaks the ice. Her head's own law made its movements beautiful, its fleet and nice. Despite the beauty compelled by this artistic law, though, the face is full of fear. This fear is perhaps that living by one's own law necessitates excess, or perhaps decadence. Their sacrificial aesthetic risks running counter to God's law. For devout Catholics, this is possibly the ultimate sacrifice. But this risk is necessary to the creation of art. They must risk allegiance to their decapitated dancing head's own law. Indeed, one might imagine that this could be the artist's law, because to create things utterly new, one must go beyond the usual, the ordinary, and see things in a way that a normal person might not. To make art requires that the poet be subjugate to her own law. She transgresses the boundaries of propriety, of authority, and of expectation. And in reimagining Salome's tale, Michael Field transgresses all of these boundaries. As journals and letters indicate, Michael Field was clearly aware throughout his career of the multivalence of authority, long before Foucault-Derrida weighed in. In the letter to Browning I quoted at the beginning of the talk was written when their first text as Michael Field appeared in 1884. And in 1911, they wrote to John Gray, who had promised to review their latest volume of poetry, instructing him to remember the singular masculine pronoun. Right? So for that span of 30 years, they're constantly focused on being poetically masculine and singular. By writing as Michael Field, they radically rewrite our notions of authorship in declaring that a single author may well be two people. And even when, as in Poems of Adoration and Mystic Trees, Bradley and Cooper write their poems separately, they still publish as one. Both texts are by Michael Field. In the poetic field, there is no Bradley, no Cooper. Indeed, their productions trouble conventional ideas of authorship, even in their materiality. The two volumes, published a year apart, were designed to be able to fit together and be bound with a specially made black leather strap, so that the two volumes would become a single text. Michael Field, therefore, has it on their own authority that they are a single author. Of course, they actually are both one author and two women, both a male writer and two female poets. This mode of understanding describes Field's approach to the Salome story and to their own poetry. It's both perverse and doctrinal, just as they're both ardent Catholic converts and subjugate to their own law. A Dance of Death might exemplify Field's coming to terms with both the writerly and the priestly authority. They affirm the naturalness of their dual authorship, and by extension, their personal bond that makes this collaboration possible. They embrace the apparent contradiction of authority and submission, of God's law and man's law, of body and spirit, and then demonstrate that no contradiction really exists. As Catherine Bradley put it in a letter responding to Andrei Rafaelovich's embarrassment at thinking that man, he wrote that he had it on the best authority that it was so. She writes back, "The best authority is my work." Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions or go back to some of those amazing images that I put past quickly.
You said that you're at Manhattan, right in the field in your undergrad and graduate studies. How did you find it?
I was hired at Georgia State because they wanted someone to teach a graduate class on literature in transition 1880 to 1920. And I had a decent grounding, but not very much in the, especially the novels because of my book, but not very much in the poetry. And so I went to the library. That's amazingly enough my first stop. There's also some amazing websites like the Victorian Women Writers Project that gathers a lot of less well-known texts. And there are also some anthologies of like Aesthetes and Decadence of the 1890s, edited by Carl Beckson, and it has like 4 Michael Field poems. And those 4 poems made me think, I would like to read more of this, and so I just followed up with others.
Thank you, that was amazing. I wonder about the title, The Dance of Death. Do you link that at all to the movie called Dance of Death?
No. But I should ask someone who knows a lot more about medieval art to tell me.
Well, in The Dance of Death, which came about during the play, it was always someone who didn't expect the death to come and take them away. And so, you know, the sort of the rich, happy person who was banqueting, and so death would come with his, you know, scythe.
That's fascinating. And Field loved medieval art and literature, and so my sense is that they would definitely know. They are, they're intimidating actually, because they know Greek backwards and forwards. They know the Bible backwards and forwards. They know art history, and they.
I have a question about the way they treat same-sex passion in their poems. Obviously indirectly, but there are a few late century women poets who write poems where the object of desire, a female poet is the speaker, but the object of desire is ambiguous. So it could be a woman, and sexual desire is certainly implicit in those poems. I'm thinking Until the Blind is one, who was known to have very, very close emotional, if not physical relationships with women. Does Michael Field write any poetry that is love poetry that could be interpreted as same-sex desire being represented?
Well, the Victorian translators of Sappho famously switched the pronoun so that it would be what they thought of as gender-appropriate expressions of desire. And Michael Field refused that altogether. And so that their poems, in the voice of Sappho, are addressed to women. And so they very much take that on. Of course, that formula is complicated by the fact they were writing under a male pseudonym. But, for instance, in Sight and Song, the poets just fully embody looking at paintings, for instance, of desirable women. They are more than happy to depict, right, a poetic persona that's desiring, but they seem very much to want to be behind that poetic persona. And so it's hard for me to say this is Michael Field talking so much as this is the voice they create. And they've worked so hard to create that voice. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, just to follow up, do any of their letters or journals discuss, I mean, I know it's really sort of an open question about relationship, but do any of the letters or journals talk about the physical desire for one another?
Well, they had lived together from the time that Cooper was 19-ish. So for basically Cooper's entire adult life, she spent living with her aunt, Catherine Bradley. And they wrote journals. There are 19 or 20 bound volumes of the joint journals that they kept together. Is it 19 or 20 or 63? It's something like that. And to me, it's sort of the same thing. Because these are thick journals. And they are fully enmeshed in each other's lives. And that's what comes out in those journals. And whether or not you need to record in a journal intimate things with someone you're living with is a question. And so it's hard to know exactly what the texture of that relationship was. But the most famous line is that when Bradley writes, "We are closer married than Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning." Right? They are two poets who live together, but we are closer married. And so that whether or not the relationship was a physical one, it was intensely intimate and absolutely, their lives were bound up together and inseparable, as any marriage would be. Actually better than many marriages perhaps might be.
I have a question about the art that you were showing. As you were talking about, it seems they really loved art, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what they were actually able to see in person and how they grew to know so much about it.
And this is something that I've read about but not studied, and so I'll do my best. They wanted to know more about art because I think they seem to want to know more about everything, and they found a way to do it. They were fortunate enough to have enough money to follow these passions, and so they contacted an art historian named Bernard Berenson, and they asked him to tour with them around Europe. And they went to all of the famous museums of Europe and looked at art with Berenson and had sort of personal tutoring in art history, looking at paintings but what they get out of them is uniquely their own vision, that they transmute the paintings. But it seems as though they feel like they need a grounding in that history and sort of range of art out there. That they did know everything.
We talked a little bit about sort of the decadence and the aesthete's reaction to the sort of Victorian norm. And then you talk about Michael Field's reaction to the sort of distance between decadence, even though that was the time period they were in. Did they write at all about sort of the mid-Victorian period? Did they have a reaction to that, or was it like less direct?
And Michael Field are complicated in how you categorize them in every way. So that they said, Lord save us from decadence. They didn't want to be associated with that kind of work. And yet, 100 years later, you read this and you think, there's a decapitated head going on this. There's not much that's more decadent than that. So they repudiated that label. At the same time, they participated in it. And part of the explanation for that is that they loved medieval things, they loved older stories, and much of their other work, their closet dramas, harkens back to other ages. They have a play about Mary Queen of Scots. They have several set in the medieval era. And so that they don't fully participate in modernity. And I think they reject much of modernity, the way the decadents do. They just reject it in a slightly different direction. And so I think they're unwitting allies, although Michael Field would like to have seen it that way. But they didn't have much to say about Victorian literature as far as I know.
How unique was this kind of literary collaboration? Were there other female couples who did the same sort of thing?
I do not know of any.
Is Somerville and Ross, Edith Somerville and Martin Ross, who were also related. They were Irish, from aristocratic families, and they wrote as Somerville and Ross, not adopting a male persona, but they similarly said that every word they wrote was a collaboration, even after Ross died. Ross was, she did use a male name. Her name was Violet Martin. But even after Violet Martin died, and Somerville, who was the older one, continued to write, she claimed that she wrote a lot after that, but Violet was writing with her. And they were buried in the same grave, So, and their books, their novels are fantastic.
So we have one other example, but
Yeah.
it's highly unusual. Right, I imagine working with a person it's a testament, I think, to the strength of that relationship.
And just because I like pop references, and I just read this in the Sunday New York Times, the interview with Ethan and Joel Cohen, they were asked directly, how do you collaborate? Which of you writes what parts of the script? They said they absolutely repudiated the idea that they're separate. Said we write everything together. There's no separating what we write. So it's an interesting contemporary example of and that's very rare in script and in filmmaking too, directors and screenwriters.
What I think is most interesting about Field, though, is that they insisted that when they were a poet, they were just one. Even when they are writing them separately, which I don't know other examples.
How do they reconcile their relationship and their Catholicism when you've seen that so in the work?
Well, and that's a very good question, and that's something that critics are most interested in. And it's hard to know how they did that because we don't know exactly what the nature of that relationship was. And so one thought is that they lived together chastely after they converted. And so that they could be a supportive network without engaging in love that is not sanctioned by the church. But there's a better question than the one I just answered, which I think is the one you asked, which is the harder question of how did they both convert to Catholicism, which condemns lesbian relationships, and know what their own background and past was. And that's a very good question. And there are lots of biographers working on answering it. And I think you can speculate without, but I don't know that you can know exactly how that happened. Other decadents who converted like John Gray became a priest, and he took all of his decadent volume of poetry, all of them, I think he wrote 3, right, and turned their spines to the wall. He didn't throw them away, right, but he put the spines that had the titles backwards, so that he accepted that they were there, but turned them around. And I imagine Michael Field doing something similar, because they never distanced themselves from their earlier work or from their earlier life.
I just wanted to be clear, so there's a possibility that they had an incestuous relationship?
Yes, and it's partly because they lived together for so long and worked together so closely, and that line that they are closer married. How you interpret that is open.
Do you know why they chose the name Michael Field? Is there any significance to?
There is. They had nicknames, Michael and Henry. Catherine was Michael and Henry was Edith. And so they took that. And do you know if there's a significance to the field? I'm not recalling it. That's where Michael comes from. And yeah, it's euphonious. It sounds good.
So when the one died, then the author disappeared. There was no writing beyond that.
And they actually died within a year of each other, and so whether there would have been a similar spiritual communal after the grave, we don't know, because actually the younger Cooper was diagnosed with cancer first, but then Catherine